Vladimir Putin declared war in a speech on national television.
Ukrainian forces on the offensive near Kyiv, taking back territory.
President Zelensky has told the UN Security Council that the Russian military must be brought to justice for alleged war crimes.
I've been covering conflict now for over a decade, and I've covered some of the most intense wars that we've seen in our time, mostly in the Middle East. And my experience so far in Ukraine and seeing the devastation that's been wrought on the Ukrainian people ranks up there as one of the worst sort of conflicts that I've seen. I think also it has a potential to get so much worse because of the level of the weaponry that we're talking about and what's at stake. And I don't mean to belittle other conflicts when I talk about this, but it is incredibly worrying, particularly as we've seen what Russia is capable of in countries like Syria, where it's been involved since 2015. We're now seeing that play out in Ukraine, and it's caused, as the UN has said, potentially the largest refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War. And it's definitely one of the largest ground invasions of Europe since the Second World War as well. Well, for weeks and weeks and weeks, we obviously had a massive build-up where there was a lot of people opining about whether Putin would take that step, whether he would invade Ukraine, or whether there would be some kind of deal struck. Was this just posturing? The general consensus among most of the Russian experts was that he wouldn't take that step, that he wouldn't dare. There was too much at stake. But then we all woke up, one morning after his speech, which to many Ukrainians was pretty chilling because it essentially denied that Ukraine had a history and existed. He did invade Ukraine, calling it a special military operation. As a newsroom, of course, we also, we had a correspondent who was already in Kyiv, and I was sent to go and cover other parts of the country. By the time I got there, it was about 2 days into the invasion. We were starting to see the first major flood of refugees coming across the border to Poland. And it hadn't quite yet clocked that this was going to be such a huge refugee crisis. As I crossed across the border, it was maybe 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning. The temperatures were -4, -5, -6. It was freezing. And it was absolute chaos. There was 50 kilometres worth of cars. And not just that, but in the darkness, as I was moving away from the border, there were just families coming out of the darkness like ghosts. Children with their pets, their dogs, their cats, just appearing from the darkness in the middle of the night, all on this 12, 13, 14-hour march towards the border. And I think that's when it really hit me that this was serious, that this had the potential to be one of the biggest events in Europe since the Second World War, and that is sadly what has played out. One of the most sort of upsetting things I think about some of the coverage of the Ukraine crisis, of this invasion, has been people saying that this is Europe, this doesn't happen in civilized countries, this happens in the backward Middle East or other countries that are somehow, born into war. And that, I think, dehumanizes refugees, and for me is quite a depressing take on what's happening. Because when I was there seeing these families, you see mothers holding their babies, carrying whatever they could find in the last 10 seconds that they left their home. People wearing whatever clothes they could find. They're carrying their cats. They're carrying, whatever it is that brings them comfort that they took in those last, seconds before they had to flee. And lots of those things, things that were precious to them have been discarded along the way. And so for me, it reminded me of scenes that I've seen in Syria, or scenes that I've seen in Libya, or scenes that I've seen in Yemen, or other parts of Europe, actually, when we had the crisis of, refugees either crossing from the Middle East across Europe. It was depressingly familiar. And that's why I think it's really important that we don't just see this as an exceptional thing that's happened in Europe, a special civilized place. That in the end, humans are humans, and families fleeing their homes are families, they're humans. One of the strangest things about covering war is entering cities where there is conflict, but where normal life still continues. So obviously when you're under extremely heavy shelling or extremely heavy airstrikes, you have these deserted areas, and you have this kind of moonscape where whole buildings have just been disintegrated into the same looking kind of ashen rubble. And actually some of the scenes that we've seen across Ukraine, reminded me of scenes that we've seen in Aleppo in Syria or in parts of Gaza. But at the same time, you very often have life going on as normal, but in a kind of slightly haunted way. So one of the first things that you notice when you enter a city like Lviv, which is away from the front line, although still under bombardment, is the air raid sirens going off. And how people have become so comfortable with that, they'll still sit there and have a cup of cappuccino and just sort of look at the sky and hope for the best. And that's in other cities as well. I mean, even in Zhytomyr, which is very close to Kyiv, that has been under heavy fire, where where I was there, where a school was hit, hospitals were hit, several homes were hit. People are still walking around, going to the ATMs, popping into cafes, in between air raid sirens, where you've got sandbagged buildings and members of the military and the territorial defence running around. And when you first enter the cities, the first thing you do is try and, at the moment, there's quite a lot of anxiety, understandably, in Ukraine over, who you are, because of concerns over what they call Russian saboteurs or, foreigners coming in. So the first thing you actually do is try and ascertain your permissions to operate within the city, and then just go and speak to people. And as I said, it's this weird mix between, a bombed out school, but then the school caretaker, making a cup of tea in the half destroyed school. So I think it's just the juxtaposition that is really disarming in these environments. So I was in Lviv at the beginning, and then we went to explore different cities that perhaps hadn't had the same level of kind of media scrutiny. So places like Humanizing, like Zhytomyr, which is actually quite a strategic city and has been hit very, very hard. Zhytomyr specifically has been hit hard because it is the home of an air base, a very important air base of a particular brigade, the 95th Air Assault Brigade, I believe its name is, that is very famous for fighting Russian-backed separatists in the east over the war that's been brewing there since 2014. Unfortunately, that's meant that residential homes have been hit, and hospitals, and maternity units and schools. We also went to places like Humanizing, like Vinnytsia. These are all key cities on what's now become the refugee trail. They're on the main crossroads that goes through Ukraine, of people either coming from the east or from the south or from Kyiv, because everyone is trying to navigate routes where you can basically make it to safety without being shelled. So you have these cities that weren't necessarily the most important cities before, that have become logistical hubs for humanitarian organisations. They've become refugee centres all along this route, as this kind of makeshift road has been forged since the invasion began. For Ukrainians, they are very clear that this is an existential threat. And that is why they have A, called for international help, including a no-fly zone, and B, why there's been such mass mobilisation of people joining volunteer groups like the civil defence or the territorial defence, or actually signing up. They saw that in Putin's speech just before he launched the invasion, where he basically denied that Ukraine has a proper history or really is culturally different from Russia. So for them, this is a fight for their nationality. This is a fight for their existence. This is a fight for their state, for their sovereignty. And they express that very deeply in every conversation that you have. At the same time, that's why they're asking for help. They keep saying, the most popular line in Ukraine is close the skies. They want a no-fly zone. They want NATO to step in. And they have said that it's not just them. So I was speaking to a former Prime Minister of Ukraine who told me that, Ukraine just happens to be the first country in the way of Russia's advance further west, and that the Baltic states and Poland, for example, are at threat. That's his belief. But I think that's shared by many Ukrainians. They see their defence as not only a defence of their own nationality and their own right to exist, but also they see themselves as the front line of defending Europe as a whole. I don't think enough has been done. I think the UK particularly has a problem with accepting refugees. We've done a lot of work on that here at The Independent. I specifically actually was working on a story about Syrian refugees in Lebanon who'd been promised resettlement back in 2018 and are still stuck in Lebanon, to the point where one of the little boys who was promised resettlement has died because he has cerebral palsy and he doesn't have the treatment that he needs in Lebanon. So we were already looking at this issue of how even through this so-called safe and legal routes, refugees are abandoned. And I think obviously the UK is trying a bit harder with Ukrainian refugees, but we still need to welcome more people. We need to drop the regulations that means that people can't have safety, and we need to contribute to helping countries like Poland, who've dealt with, I think it's over 2 million people now coming across their borders. I've mostly been based in the Middle East my entire life, and I have mostly focused on the Middle East. I've seen what Putin's forces have been capable of in Syria. I've seen Putin enacting his playbook in Syria. And I think one of the biggest problems that journalists who've been covering Syria have faced is basically global fatigue, is the kind of assumption that Syrians are just born into war and everything about their country is to do with war. And there's almost an erasure of memory of a country that existed before the conflict erupted. And I think that's been actually incredibly dangerous, and actually maybe is why we're here today. Because There wasn't global outrage at Russia intervening in the Syrian conflict in 2015 and supporting Assad's regimes, using banned weaponry and murdering civilians. There wasn't sanctions on Russia to the same extent. There was the opposite, actually. And so the problem is that we've seen these tactics being used against humans, against families. And the world has kind of met it with a shrug, because it's just Syria. It's not a civilized country. They don't look like us, etc., etc. For me, what we're seeing play out in Ukraine, we've already seen play out in other, and it's not just the Middle East, I'm talking about the Middle East because that's where I live and that's where I was born and that's where I grew up. We've seen it in other parts of the world as well. And that's why I'm also concerned about what the future holds for this particular conflict, because I know how nasty it could get. That doesn't mean that somehow British, the UK has a spotless reputation as well. We also invaded Iraq in 2003 and, crimes were committed, etc., etc. So this is not me, saying somehow the UK, is a blinding light in the world and just targeting Russia, but specifically in this context, we've seen this play out in Syria and now we're seeing it play out in Ukraine, and nothing was said at the beginning, and people have almost forgotten that there's war in Syria. And I think that's the danger, because injustice somewhere is injustice everywhere, and in this particular instance, it's directly related. And that is why we cannot ignore actions that happen in places that we don't necessarily have an affinity to or care about, because ultimately it's all connected, and that's what we're seeing happen right now. So I've come back to the UK very briefly to pick up more equipment, and I'm actually heading back to Ukraine in the next few hours. And I think my biggest concern is that we haven't seen the worst yet. I have covered Syria for over a decade now, and Russia first got involved in, I think, September 2015. And I've seen what they're capable of in terms of what they've been inflicting on Syrian civilians for years. And their support of the Assad regime in Syria, who has used, according to very respected human rights groups and also journalists, has used chemical weapons, incendiary weapons, cluster munitions, banned weaponry that causes serious harm to civilians. So my fear is that what we're seeing is horrendous in Ukraine, but there is so much more that could happen. And there doesn't appear to be a clear route out for peace negotiations, for peace talks, anytime soon. And we're already seeing that playing out in terms of cities being wiped off the map in Ukraine. And so my biggest concern is that this is just going to get worse. And ultimately it's going to be children and the elderly and families that are going to be bearing the brunt of this.